inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to this month's Ummatics Colloquium. My name is Aisha and I'm the forum coordinator at Ummatics. It's our first colloquium of the year, alhamdulillah, and we have a distinguished panel of speakers with us today and an exciting conversation ahead. This month's colloquium is entitled Pathways to Ummatic Integration and aims to address one of the foremost questions related to a project of Muslim unification. The lack of integration among Muslim majority countries is frequently lamented by scholars in the region. The Middle East in particular is the least economically integrated region in the world, despite an abundance of shared culture, history, natural resources, and languages. In the 1990s, former Turkish Prime Minister Necmettin Erbakan attempted to create the D8 network of Muslim majority countries, including Bangladesh, Egypt, Iran, Indonesia, and Nigeria, among others. But the efforts dwindled against the backdrop of domestic political and economic crises. Even the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, while relevant in certain spheres, has largely failed to facilitate cooperation between Muslim states on the most important issues. Consequently, the hard borders between people, goods, and governments remain the greatest challenge to any project seeking to challenge the status quo. However, there are numerous ways in which this lack of integration may be confronted. One is by that of the multilateral organization, and this is the focus of Dr. Alex Thurston's upcoming paper for the Ummatics Institutes, Secular Integration Models and Global Governance Systems. In the post-colonial era, such organizations have been one of the primary mechanisms that states have used to increase cooperation and build regional bridges. And despite their undeniable weaknesses, these organizations have remade the landscape of global politics today. Dr. Thurston's paper specifically assesses the multilateral organization as a vehicle of ummatic integration and considers its possibilities and limitations based on historical examples of the most powerful multilateral organizations since 1945, including the UN, the EU, the African Union, and the Association of Southeast Asian States, or ASEAN, among others. In today's presentation, he will highlight core considerations that emerge from his analysis and reflect on why ummatic thinkers will likely have to look beyond the multilateral organization as a template for future integration. We're grateful to have him with us to present today. Dr. Alex is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Cincinnati. His research focuses on Islam and politics in Northwest Africa, and he has conducted field research in Senegal, Nigeria, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria. He is the author of Salafism in Nigeria, Islam, Preaching and Politics, published in 2016, Boko Haram, The History of an African Jihadist Movement, published in 2018, and Jihadists of North Africa and the Sahel, Local Politics and Rebel Groups, published in 2020. We're also very grateful to have our first respondent for today as Dr. Imad Shaheen. Dr. Imad is the Shawaf Visiting Professor of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University. Until 2022, he was the Dean of the College of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. Before joining the College of Islamic Studies, he was the Hasib Sabagh Distinguished Visiting Chair of Arabic and Islamic Studies and a visiting professor of political science at the School of Foreign Services at Georgetown University. He has authored, co-authored, and co-edited 6 books and has more than 50 scholarly publications, including journal articles, book chapters, and encyclopedia entries. He is the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam and Politics and co-editor with John Esposito of the Oxford Handbook of Islam and Politics, Key Islamic Political Thinkers, published in 2018, and Islam and Politics Around the World, published in 2018 also. Our second respondent for today is Dr. Omar Ba. Dr. Omar is an assistant professor in the Department of Government at Cornell University. His primary areas of research focus on law, violence, race, humanity, and world orders in global politics. He is the author of States of Justice, The Politics of the International Criminal Court, published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. So we're very excited for our conversation today and grateful to all of our speakers for sparing us the time on a Saturday as well to come and speak to us. After our presentations, we will have our usual Q&A session for the second hour of the event, but we also encourage our listeners to make use of the general chat box to share your thoughts on the presentation throughout the event, and you can submit questions that the speakers will have an opportunity to answer in the Q&A session in the dedicated question and answer box throughout the event as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Alex to start us off with his presentation. The floor is yours.
So, Assalamu alaikum everybody. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim and Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. So thanks very much for having me, and thanks very much to the respondents and for everybody to taking the time on a Saturday. I've been really excited about the Ummatics project, and specifically this question of how integration could proceed concretely, and I wanted to make a contribution to that. This is quite different than some of my normal work, but I think it comes in part out of watching politics in West Africa, and in particular in the last 2 years or so, since 2020. The regional economic and political organization there, the main one called ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, has really been in the spotlight, as there have been coups in Mali, coups in Burkina Faso, and this has sort of refocused my attention on the role of the regional organization, or the multilateral organization in politics. And I think in West Africa in particular, there's been a lot of it's been shown the limits of the power of these regional organizations and so forth. So this is one part, or one thing that's been on my mind. The paper looks at what I'm calling kind of secular models, and secular is a hard term to define, but one thing I should say at the outset is that the paper specifically does not look at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and does not look at the Muslim World League. And I've recommended to Dr. Anjum and to the project that they have a separate paper, or more than one, looking at the OIC and the Muslim World League, but because I think they deserve a separate and in-depth study. So my paper then looks at, as Aisha was mentioning, it looks at the United Nations, the EU, the AU, other kinds of multilateral organizations around the world, to try to extrapolate lessons that the Ummah might take from those in terms of the prospects for that path as a form of integration. And the paper comes out pessimistic on that question for various reasons. That's not a pessimism about Ummatic integration. That's a pessimism just on my part about the specific path of the multilateral organization as a means of realizing Ummatic integration. But I think that there's a lot of room for debate on this question, obviously, and I think that I'll even try to gesture, inshallah, toward a few potential counter arguments against what I'm saying. But to me, I think the reason for my pessimism is fairly basic, just looking at the way that multilateral organizations tend to be, in my view, dominated by certain powerful member states, and how that can sort of subvert the promise of equality and integration that multilateral organizations hold out. So I thought I would then just quickly read sort of the 10 core findings from the paper, and these again are all just my opinion. One is, the first is, efforts at integration and global or regional governance often trigger assertions of national sovereignty, so that you get this kind of push-pull dynamic that the more effort there is to integrate, the more that certain states can balk at having to surrender their sovereignty. And the multilateral organization is often predicated in part on a voluntary surrendering of part of sovereignty, which sets up tensions and potential contradictions. Sometimes states, of course, are willing to surrender some of their sovereignty if they see a benefit, but sometimes they do that, of course, just on a temporary or conditional basis. Second, efforts to form fully integrated units or even cohesive federations out of 2 or more nations have often collapsed within a very short time, although there are a few counterexamples. So with the second point, I was thinking specifically of the United Arab Republic, 1958 to 1961, and then the very short-lived Mali Federation, which was an effort to integrate Mali and Senegal right at independence. And these are this is the strongest form of multilateral organization that one could imagine, almost, where multiple units are thinking of even combining into one single unit. And this is, at least with these examples, questions of leadership and power come up immediately, which then can threaten the cohesion of the effort to integrate. There are counterexamples to this. What maybe the foremost would be the reintegration of East and West Germany into a unified Germany. But I think one could debate whether Germany was a special case in that regard. The other thing that could be said on this question is I think one could argue that centrifugal forces are more powerful in the world at this point than centripetal ones. So we've seen, I would say, more examples of the breakup of states, the breakup of Sudan into Sudan and South Sudan, the breakaway of Eritrea from Ethiopia, the effort of Somaliland to gain, formal and complete diplomatic recognition. There's a lot, to my mind, those examples stand out more than examples of integration. The third point that I make in the paper is a few regional or global powers often dominate organizations that are meant to be multilateral and inclusive. This is the point that I mentioned before. So one can think first and foremost of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council and how they I have a 6-year-old with me here at home, so he's making a small cameo here. And so I think a couple of different powers again can subvert some of the okay, here you go. Can you close the door on your way out, please? Thanks. Sorry, everybody. Okay, so a couple powers can then subvert or dominate the multilateral organization, and that, of course, can set up tensions and problems. And I think this would come up too in a separate study on the OIC and the Muslim World League too. Number 4, the creation of a regional bloc can trigger the formation of a rival bloc or other counter reactions, and thereby undercutting wider integration prospects. Here, actually, the example that came to mind, and this is not a secular example, but in other work, I've been looking a little bit at competition between Morocco and Algeria. And so both of them, for example, have what they call leagues of African or Sahelian ulama. And the Moroccan, league or foundation seems to have triggered an Algerian, counter reaction. And so in a way, this is integration, but then if there's 2 rival efforts, then of course it can undercut the ultimate potential for unity. Number 5, the easing of trade and border controls with a corresponding increase in the freedom of movement and labor within particular regional zones has been the most successful and stable form of integration in the post-1945 world. So I think that this is, and successful for whom, one could ask, but I think this is often what regional organizations have achieved the most, is the ability for people to move and for capital to move. And I would say that to some extent the Ummah should cheer on the ability of people to move around, because I think that this can promote obviously the exchange of ideas and so forth. The free movement of capital, of course, has been a real problem for especially some developing countries. Okay. Number 6, even the most successful integration projects are vulnerable to reversals, as was infamously demonstrated by Brexit. And that's, of course, Brexit isn't a complete reversal of the EU, and I was reading some interesting work saying that the example, that the prospects for, an exit by any other country, such as Italy, are probably fairly limited at the moment. But the Brexit example does show, a major power leaving one of the most successful regional projects in the world. Number 7, overdoses of multilateralism can be counterproductive. So in some countries, and in particular here, I'm thinking of certain conflict zones, there can be almost a sort of traffic jam of multilateral organizations and so forth trying to intervene. I guess I'm thinking most specifically of Mali. So in Mali, there have been many actors trying to solve the crisis in Mali. So you have a UN peacekeeping force, you have a regional organization called the G5 Sahel, you have the European Union involved, you have the economic community of West African states involved, and there's been what's called a kind of a security traffic jam, and I think one could even argue a diplomatic traffic jam. So sort of more, and none of it has necessarily solved the crisis in Mali. So I think one could argue that again, there can be overdoses of multilateralism in certain places. Number 8, the eighth finding: most surviving integration models since 1991, in other words, since the fall of the Soviet Union, have been compatible with and deferential to capitalism, but have also been adaptable. And that, of course, raises all sorts of questions for the Ummah, and obviously there's a huge range of Muslim viewpoints on capitalism at this point. But this does seem to be part of the prospects for success of any multilateral organization, is how compatible it is with capitalism. Although capitalism, as I'm trying to say, is partly a moving target. Number 9, secular integration models will be hard to reimagine in explicitly religious terms under present circumstances, given that some integration models, especially at the regional level, depend on secular notions of citizenship. The idea of what it means to be a citizen, which is kind of fundamental to these, to these multilateral organizations, and especially to the opening up of movement and so forth, depends on the idea that citizenship is correlated first and foremost to one's belonging in a nation state. I think that Sheikh Yasir Qadhi, Hafidhullah, has made this point well in one lecture that I listened to, that it's seen now as totally normal to basically discriminate on the question of nation state origin, but it's seen as abhorrent to discriminate on or to draw lines based on religious belonging and so forth. So to create a kind of explicitly religious notion of citizenship or belonging would I think elicit a lot of pushback in the world at this point. So transferring from the secular sphere to the Islamic sphere could be quite difficult in terms of conceiving of how people belong to a political unit or a multilateral organization. Number 10, though, I said Ummadic thinkers should cheer on and advocate for certain forms of secular integration due to their Ummadic benefits, namely those forms of integration that allow for the freer movement of people. Again, this is just my view, but I would say, for example, that Brexit was bad for the Ummah, right? That things that restrict the movement of people, that make it more difficult for people to cross borders or to set up lives in another country than their own, that those limit the circulation of ideas and people within the Ummah as well, and that this is a net negative. I'm not saying that the Ummah should cheer on again, unrestricted free trade or sort of the full economic side of this, but I think to just, at least again with the movement of people, that more movement is better than less for the Ummah at this point. So these are then some of the findings. I think one could push back in multiple ways. Obviously, I think one could say, okay, well, isn't this the most pragmatic path? In other words, creating a multilateral organization, a strong multilateral organization of Muslim states, isn't this the most pragmatic path for integration, right? One could say, okay, look, we're stuck with the nation state. If you want more integration, then combining different nation states into a larger unit is the most feasible and easily imaginable way to go. One could also push back and say, look, okay, a certain handful of strong states might dominate a multilateral organization, but that's what's most feasible, right? And if you can have a couple of states that are willing to put up the resources, or that are willing to back an organization, then that's what you're stuck with, and you sort of push those states or try to count on those states as being relatively benevolent actors, even if they dominate some of the weaker members of that system. I think one could also push back and say, okay, the prospects for forming for combining multiple nation states into a single political unit are maybe stronger than I'm saying, right? One could say, look, the example of the Mali Federation, the example of the UAR, these come from the late 1950s, early 1960s. We live in a fundamentally different context at this point, and there are maybe more room for imagination. So I think I have strong views on some questions, but actually the views that I put forward in this paper are sort of experimental and are meant to stimulate debate. So I would welcome actually differences of opinion and pushback on these questions. So this is my summary of the paper then, so I'll leave it there, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, Dr. Alex, for getting the conversation started. I think as well, we will come back to you after, inshallah, the respondents, just to give you an opportunity to comment on their thoughts as well. In that case, though, what we'll do now is we'll come to our first respondent, Dr. Imad. Dr. Imad, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And it's always a pleasure to see familiar faces of good friends, former students. And let me just begin by thanking, of course, Ummatics and the organizers for giving me this opportunity to participate in this panel. It's really an immense pleasure for me to share this panel with Professor Alex and Professor Omar. So I know that it's going to be extremely beneficial and useful, as I really benefited from reading this wonderful and excellent paper of Dr. Alex. I start by disagreeing with Dr. Alex that this is an experimental project. Actually, it's a very well thought of project, as it shows in the paper. The paper is very well designed and carefully crafted. And I have to admit to you, whenever I think of, a point that I should raise with you, I see it, like you mentioned that point, maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs later, or in the conclusion. So you preempt even my kind of, concerns or the questions that I might raise for you. Okay, so what I'm going to do actually is benefit from your presence, because it's an excellent paper. It raises a lot of very important issues for the Muslim Ummah. So the objective of my remarks are exactly as such. I mean, just to benefit from your knowledge and also benefit from your presence with us. The paper, of course, as I mentioned, provides a comprehensive list of questions, clarifications, sound and fair findings, as we have seen and as you have presented, and also significant lessons for the Ummatic thinkers, which is very important, of course, to consider, especially in this kind of transitional phase. In brief, or in sum, it is really an enjoyable and enriching reading that, as the paper purports, opens the way to further research, and indeed it does. So this is exactly what one benefit from that paper, because it really opens so many possibilities, so many scenarios, options that, as you mentioned, need to be addressed in separate places. Now, the place of the Muslim nation in the world is a pertinent issue since the development of a seer, or the international relations and international law in Islam. So here we are dealing with the issue of integration. And this is the main core of the paper, as you mentioned, particularly the integration of the Ummah within a multilateral organizations that are secular in orientation and different also in development and in evolution. Here we immediately notice, and correct me if I'm wrong, an implicit differentiation between the Muslim Ummah and the Muslim states. And I think this is where many of the kind of problematic issues might arise, or the clarifications are going to be needed. The paper brilliantly explains the evolution of multilateral organizations, the power dynamics, pros and cons, and the lessons that the Ummah can draw from these dynamics. But I wish, as I mentioned, to benefit from your presence, Dr. Alex, and your knowledge about the topic, and focus on the concept of integration itself. I know there are really a myriad of wonderful ideas, but just let me focus on integration, because it might produce, useful findings and also conclusions. And I have also to concede that the paper has addressed many of the issues that I might raise, but it's good to hear your response regarding these issues while you are with us here. So my first question is, what kind of integration are we exactly talking about? organizational integration, economic integration, cultural integration, social or political, or all of the above? This seems to be a very simple question, but it might need some kind of clarification, because the shape of that integration has to be defined. The expectations and aspirations behind this integration also needs to be explained to us, so we know exactly what we are entering into. The second thing is the level of integration. Are we talking about states? Or are we talking about the nation itself, the Ummah itself? And this is, of course, I will address it here quickly, because the discussion here, it has to be differentiated as the levels also are different. So if we're talking about integration, almost as we mentioned, almost all the members of the OIC already integrated in the world system. We know this is not the integration that we are talking about. They are integrated structurally, culturally, economically, but the intra-Muslim integration, as Aisha and you mentioned, is what's missing, and what's actually we are talking about in this regard. If we talk about economic integration, of course, the OIC has set a target of 20% intra-trade relations between, or exchange between, Muslim countries, and until now they haven't reached that level of integration. So it is really minimal as compared to 80% with the rest of the world. Some experts even mentioned that there is a potential for increase of intra-Muslim trade up to 50 or 60%, and not the less than 20% that you have now. So the idea here is that the Muslim states are more integrated in the world economy and in the world system than amongst themselves, and maybe than the Muslim nation itself, which the paper, of course, explains very clearly. So the audience here must be the Ummah, which limits its pathways. And this is, again, another thing that Dr. Alex mentioned in the paper, which I really liked very much. And he mentioned even in the presentation at the end, when he mentioned that there are other pathways. So I would love, of course, I would like him also to elaborate on this, just to tell us, because this would be very beneficial to us from the Ummah perspective. What are the other pathways that the Ummah as Ummah can pursue? And given the authoritarian nature of most Muslim states, can the Muslim nation, Muslim peoples, the Ummah itself, pursue these pathways? Now, I have some kind of quick points about the findings and the lessons. The 10 findings, of course, as we heard, are fair and outstanding, as a matter of fact. They are really to the point, and they are very accurate. But my question here is, and again, it's not I'm not questioning, I just need clarification. Are these findings for future considerations when we ponder, for example, a fresh integration into the world system, or they are meant to reform the existing system? And this is, if this is so, the idea is to try to reform, to interact with the existing system. Is this the work of intellectuals or the work of states? Because as we know, IR, international relations, foreign policy, is the realm of the states. However, it's not mutually exclusive. Like, for example, if the states end, so the intellectual cannot do it. But is it fair to say that this project, in this case, is going to be a political project more than an intellectual project? And how can we reconcile between the two? And how can we, even if we pursue it from an intellectual perspective? Because I think you mentioned that at some point, that the exchange of values, the exchange of people, the exchange of like interaction and encounters, more encounters, is an excellent and positive way. So how can we save this project from the political ramifications? Is that possible? Also, I want to share other points with Dr. Alex, and I know you mentioned that in your paper, but that some of them are maybe beyond the scope of the paper. But I think it's it's a good opportunity that you are here, and then we can you can give us your input on this. The first point is about the value system. that's governing the international system and international relations. And the difference in value systems between an Islamic perspective, the theoretical one, of course, and of course the global or the realistic perspective. For example, if you look at the value system from an Islamic perspective, as you know, a dominant value system or value in the Muslim value system, the international one, is justice. And we talk here about justice, it's justice ضد الظلم, as opposed to zulm or oppression or transgression, adwan, and so on. It's also justice for distribution of wealth and justice for mutual cooperation and development. The second point, and I'll say why I'm saying this point, the international system, as the paper says, came out of wars and conflicts. Its core values are to prevent wars and promote peace. And it has been struggling to improve its shabby performance, SDGs, prosperity, environment, etc., but it still has a long way to go. Perhaps these are areas where the Muslim Ummah can make a tangible contribution. I don't know whether you can agree with me or not, but the question is how, and how can that be effective? Another point to consider, of course, when discussing integration is the strategic interests or priorities of the Muslim Ummah and how they differ from, as you mentioned, major powers that govern and manage that system. One, of course, is the economic security of the Ummah, the issue of poverty, the issue of growth, the issue of distribution. The second priority or strategic interest is the cultural security of the Ummah, Islamophobia, the issue of burning the Quran and the responses, and from a Muslim perspective towards these kind of acts of aggression, the universalization of Western values and the hegemony of certain norms, also social, the refugees, the issues of traditions and values, this issue of superimposing a particularistic or eccentric values on the rest of the globe as if they are normal values and so on. Finally, I will conclude with a brief reference to the reality of Muslim states. As we know, Muslim states, their hearts, qiblatuhum, are oriented toward, is oriented outward and not inward. And look now at the open secret about the undercover trade between Israel and a few big Muslim countries. It's becoming widespread, it's becoming common now. Also their perception, these states' perceptions of regional security is completely messed up. No vision, hostility towards and weakening of potentially core strategic Muslim allies. Look at the stance towards Iran, the stance toward Turkey, the marginalization of important countries within the Muslim system of operation of Indonesia, of Malaysia, of Nigeria, and so on. And how can we make a Muslim nation qualified, and that's the last one, and equipped to engage positively at the cultural and value levels? And finally, I wish to hear more about the other pathways that Dr. Alex has referred to, because I'm really interested to hear about this, and he referred to this in his excellent paper. And I really enjoyed reading this paper. I benefited a lot from it, and it was very, for me, enriching and informative. And I really thank you so much, Professor Alex.
Jazakallah khair, Professor Imad. Thank you so much for offering your thoughts there. Just a note to the audience, it's great to see people offering their thoughts in the chat box. We will also be dropping a couple of polls. So feel free to vote anonymously and express your opinion on some of the issues that are being raised by the speakers as they're contributing. But now, inshallah, we'll go to our second respondent, Dr. Omar. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Aisha. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. I'm very honored and humbled to share this space with all of you. And I will echo Dr. Imad's comments that this was a really great paper. It was very well structured, and the 10 findings of Alex, despite their quite not very optimistic outlook, were a lot of materials to think about, and it was a great learning on this topic from the paper. Let me also say that I am not a scholar of Islamic studies or of the Muslim world. I do not speak Arabic. I've tried learning in the past and I failed. I'm a scholar of international relations and global politics. So that's what I've been working on lately, and my comments here will be coming from that perspective, from an IR perspective and the global governance. My main takeaway about this is that Alex argues that ummatic integration would necessarily need a vehicle or vehicles, which would likely have to be in the form of a multilateral organization, if not an international organization. And this integration coming from multilateral organizations would benefit from learning what has worked well regarding all the international organizations, even the secular ones, and also trying to avoid the pitfalls of what hasn't worked that well in terms of secular integration models. And in the spirit of constructive feedback, and this will echo some of the comments that Dr. Imad has provided as well. I want just to raise a few questions regarding ummatic integration coming from a global governance world orders perspective. First, when we speak of this world order that may emanate from ummatic integration, what kind of world order would that be? Will it be international, global in its essence, or following Mearsheimer's different characterizations of world orders, would it be a bounded / regional world order? That's a question that is worth pondering. But again, also, when we speak of an ummatic integration and a world order that would come out of that integration, what do we mean by order itself? And this also echoes some of the comments that Dr. Imad has made earlier. If we take orders from an IR perspective to refer to sets of rules and institutions and organizing principles and governing arrangements among states, not exclusively, but primarily, and the sets of shared practices, it would be helpful to think about what all of these concepts would entail for an ummatic world order. What kind of organizing principles, what kind of governing arrangements, what kind of shared practices and expectations would be involved in such integration. And as we know also throughout history, different world orders have come and gone. Typically, world orders has emerged in the wake of a great upheaval, most often in the aftermath of great wars, whether it's the 1648 Westphalian Order or the 1815 after the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna, or 1919 after World War I and the disappearance of the demise of the Ottoman Empire, also Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, or after World War II or 1989. All these world orders that have emerged have come about after main catalytic events, oftentimes great wars. And these events have led to the demise of the previous order, delegitimize those institutions and allowed for those actors who were on the winning side of these wars to lay down their tracks and the sets of institutions that have led to the emergence of a new order. This is what is referred to by some political scientists as the critical junctures. Now, to think of Umatic integration and the order that could come out of it, we would have probably to ponder about what kind of catalyst is likely to lead to such integration, and can that be anticipated? My second main point here is that if we are thinking of the vehicles that would be the main force that would bring out that integration, we may think about it through the perspective of the principal agent problem in IR. This refers to the idea that international organizations are vehicles or agents who are operating on the behalf of a principle. And in this case, mostly the principles are the states. The agents, meaning the international organizations, are more effective at solving some kind of problems, such as the collective action problem. They are more efficient at doing it. They can link different issues. They can provide a forum to solve problems that arise. They can help us save time and resources for the states. Hence, the states are designing them in a rational way that would maximize that output. Alex is skeptical about the role of nation states in this integrative model, and I totally agree with, and I share that skepticism about the role and usefulness and emancipatory potential of nation states. But we may still need to think about this integration would be operated through and how it will deal with the principal agent problems. Who will be the principals? Who will be represented by this integrative model, by this multilateral organization? If it's not the nations and the states, then who or what would be the principles in this case? And my third point here, and I will stop there, is to raise the what Finnemore and Barnett has referred to as the pathologies of international organizations. That oftentimes, once organizations are put in place to fulfill a mission, because they would be more efficient at fulfilling that mission, rather than states having to do it on an individual basis, they are delegates. The organizations are delegates of the states. They carry out mandates from the states in this case, but it doesn't have necessarily to be states. And in the case of Umatic integration, of course, probably they could be engines for and delegates from all the communities, all the polities beyond just their state. But in any case, Barnett and Finnemore, excuse me, talk about how these organizations oftentimes tend to develop what they call the pathologies, meaning that at some point they will start acquiring their own identity, which is divorced from that they were bestowed upon to begin with. They will start developing their own interests, therefore fulfilling missions that may not align necessarily with that for which they were created in place. So this is also another point to to ponder about the effectiveness of such integrative models and what kind of organization would be able to carry out that mission without developing these pathologies that Barnett and Finnemore have pointed out. I'll stop there, and again, the 10 findings that Alexa has put forth are really enlightening, and it's a very well thought analysis, and I enjoyed a great deal reading it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Omar, for raising some really interesting and important points there. So alhamdulillah, we have some time as well to go back to you, Dr. Alex, to respond to some of the issues that were raised by both of the respondents.
Yeah, so Jazakumullah khairan. I mean, these are really from both of you, rich points and give me a lot to think about, inshallah. I mean, I think to respond to just some of it, I mean, in terms of the difference between the Muslim Ummah and the Muslim states, and this came up a lot this came up with a few comments in the chat too. I mean, this is really important. I mean, obviously the Ummah has to be, I think, thought of very differently than the Muslim states. I mean, for one thing, there's the Muslim presence in the West, and a lot of us here are part of that, obviously. And then also some states are difficult to categorize as Muslim states, right? Is Nigeria a Muslim state or not? One could argue it both ways, right? There's probably a slight Muslim majority in Nigeria, I think, depending on how one extrapolates from past census data. But on the other hand, there's a substantial Christian and just non-Muslim, non-Christian population there too. So I think the Ummah, right, is very different from the Muslim states. And then one could ask, what does it even mean to talk about a Muslim state, right? A state that happens to be ruled by somebody who's Muslim and that has a large Muslim population is not necessarily like a Muslim state in the full sense of that term. So I think that, yeah, the Ummah goes well beyond just the states. But this ties in, as you were saying, Professor Shaheen, to the question of the other pathways. I think, the short answer, I think maybe this is a cop-out, but I don't know. I mean, I think that the other pathways require a tremendous act of imagination. I think one could say that Ummadic integration is proceeding in all sorts of ways from the bottom up, right? And obviously the Ummadics Institute is at the forefront of that. To have people in touch with one another from different parts of the world, to, the increasing spaces for debate that the internet offers, the movement of people, the conversations that can now occur simultaneously in different places. I think all that is already Ummadic integration, like unfolding before our eyes. On the other hand, I think that bottom up integration of the Ummah, or maybe we could say integration taking place from like the medio, like the meso level too, because there are people, it's not just sort of all organic bubbling up from the bottom. There are people such as Dr. Anjum who are consciously trying to promote linkages. But even from like the bottom up level or the meso level, eventually this runs into questions of power, right? And all those, domains that you highlighted, right? Political integration, economic integration, security integration, and so forth. There's a limit to what can be done without the power of the state, right? A bottom up integration of the Ummah through discourse cannot solve the problem of Palestine, right? I mean, eventually questions of hard power come into play. So I guess I was thinking, in terms of the other pathways, I mean, Dr. Kaminsky has written a paper about the bankruptcy, as I read his paper, of the nation state, right? And thinking about, beyond the nation state. I think that could be part of these other pathways. But yeah, I find this really challenging to think about, and I think in some ways it's got to be a group endeavor, inshallah, to think about what other paths could look like. To go to the other part of something you raised about what type of integration we're really talking about, I think I was thinking, on the whole about political integration, collective decision making, centralized decision making within the Ummah, and I think a lot of other things flow from that. But but yeah, I think all forms of integration were kind of in my mind as I was thinking about the paper. Let me see if there's other sorts of questions. I mean, yeah, what you were saying about the the hegemony of certain norms, the difference between the Islamic value system and the prioritization of justice versus the current world system and its prioritization of preventing war and promoting trade. And I don't think the current world system is doing very well at either of those, right? And how the Ummah could make a more tangible contribution. That's something else that I'll have to think about a lot, inshallah. I mean, I think that, and that could even be the topic of other papers, right? How could you know, Muslims and Muslim states wield more power within you know, existing multilateral fora such as, you know, the UN or others? That's a huge question, and I don't have a good answer for that sort of off the top of my head, but it gives me a lot to think about. Turning to Professor Ba's points, I think, yeah, this is really, really interesting about the catalysts, right? As you were saying, you know, with all the different dates you mentioned, you know, from 1648 to 1989, and how typically there was a, you know, a catalyzing event or crisis, then the previous order fell apart, and then the winners, as you said very bluntly, get to design the new order. Yeah, and I think thinking about catalysts is really important. I mean, and I think that could come from different directions. I mean, including in ways that would be grim and catastrophic, right? I mean, the first catalyst that occurred to me is climate change, right? You know, or maybe the end of the likely eventual end of the kind of, you know, fossil fuel based you know, energy system. These are going to provoke, you know, serious crises, obviously, with a lot of suffering for Muslims, unfortunately, in store. But I think that your point about how to anticipate, you know, these catalysts and then how to take advantage of them. I mean, and I don't think that has to be opportunistic. I think that can come actually from a place of compassion, to say there are places of points of crisis coming down the road, and that they need to be responded to, you know, thoughtfully and in ways that benefit the Ummah, inshallah. So yeah, I mean, but yeah, I think, I mean, climate change and the collapse maybe of the, I don't know, the rentier state or something, those are the first ones that occur to my mind. Yeah, I think the principal agent problem was really, I mean, really well put, and yeah, I think that and I should say, I mean, despite my pessimism in the paper, I mean, I should, you know, I should say I would really like to see a powerful, you know, effective multilateral Muslim organization, right? I think that would be amazing to see, inshallah. I mean, I'm just sort of pessimistic about the prospects, but yeah, then as you warn, not even that powerful organization could take, you know, could take on these pathologies that you mentioned, right? And could start to represent its own interests. So yeah, this is all just sort of to respond with some initial thoughts, but yeah, you both given me a lot to think about, inshallah, as I revise the paper. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, alhamdulillah. On that note, then we can open up the floor to our panelists and to our attendees to ask their questions to the speakers directly, or indeed make comments. As always, please, you know, you can raise your hand to pose your comment to or question to the speaker directly. And if you could keep your comments and questions as concise as possible to around 2 minutes, it allows us to get through as many people as we can. Or you can drop your question into the Q&A box and we will, inshallah, read them out and get through to them. So we are open to anybody who wishes to raise their hand. Dr.
Right, what you need signed.
Oh.
And notarized on our end.
Okay, Dr. Hussamuddin, go ahead. Dr. Hussam, can you hear us? Hello?
Okay. Hello. Do you hear my voice now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Alexander, for drawing such constructive ideas. Actually, we look forward to continuing the dialogue on how we can accommodate the Ummah in modern and viable new structures. In this regard, I wonder why you didn't extend your analysis on multilateral organizations to include the European Union. You have already mentioned it as an example of multilateral organizations, but you confined the analysis to other organizations. Many Muslim thinkers indeed have been aspired to an European Union style confederation of democratic Muslim states. For example, in the words of Inayat Bingilawala, the British Muslim leader, a confederation of democratic states based on the European Union model of now that would be a caliphate that I can imagine myself living in. This meaning also has been nicely captured by Abdul Wahab Al-Afandi, and I am quoting here from his book, Who Needs an Islamic State? He said, the European community and the United States of America reflect some characteristics of the model we have in mind. Here, membership of a particular state doesn't preclude free movement between different states, nor is there a loss of any significant rights. A future international order based on Islamic principles would be comparable to these models. So from my point of view, I don't think that the Brexit represented a pessimistic incident. I don't think that Brexit incident produced sufficient evidence for downplaying the European Union as a good applicable model in our time. We indeed see almost the same concept applied and still operating in United States of America, for example. So please let me have your insight and clarity on this issue. I think European Union, from the point of many Muslim thinkers, is applicable model or the most suggested model in our time. Thank you, Dr. Alex, again, and thanks to Prof. Aisha and Prof. Oimer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hussam. Dr. Alex, why don't you go ahead and then we'll come to some other questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think this is really well said. I mean, yeah, and I don't want to say that Brexit, fundamentally undermined the EU. I think that would be way too strong, right? I mean, and as I was saying, I think that from what I understand, from what I've read from various experts, it seems like other exits are not very likely in the short term, or even the medium term. Italy or others. Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that maybe I should do more in the paper to talk about, even while being sort of pessimistic, to talk about the relative advantages of different types of models that exist and why some might be more appealing than others, even if there are, limitations or obstacles that one could foresee with any type of integration model like this. Yeah, I mean, I think, the EU, I mean, obviously to echo Professor Omar's point, I mean that crisis and upheaval was a key catalyst for the formation of the EU and for other systems like it. So you would again back to that question of where such a catalyst would come from. Obviously it's like geographically contiguous, so where in the Muslim world would such an organization kind of originate from? And I think maybe one point that I was thinking about when you were speaking is that I could bring out in the paper more is the extent to which Umatic models of multilateral integration, if they came about, would be competing with other models that already exist in different parts of the Muslim world, right? I mean, if there was an effort to replicate the EU within, the Middle East or North Africa, that would obviously be competing in some sense with the Arab League or with the GCC or whatever it might be, depending on what part we're talking about. So I think that, I can definitely understand the appeal of the EU. I mean, there have been obviously complaints, serious divisions and tensions within the EU regarding power dynamics, right? And then you're back a little bit to the domination of certain states over others, right? Folks can probably tell that I come from the left, if that's not clear already. So I mean, the sense that Germany really dominated Greece, for example, that it was very unfair how different dynamics worked within when there was economic crisis within different countries. So I think that there can be I think that the EU, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in a way one could say it's the most successful regional model far and away. But then even within the EU, there's these serious kind of power imbalances and the domination of certain strong states over weak states.
I want to, just before we come to Brother Abdurrahman Rashdan and Dr. Osama, bring in Dr. Imad and Dr. Omar for their thoughts on that in terms of the EU as the most successful model or a potential model for the region. Perhaps Dr. Imad, you can go first.
Thank you, sure. Well, the historical circumstances differ from one region and from one country to another. So the conditions that created or under which the EU evolved are totally different from those of for example, let's say the Middle Eastern system or the even Muslim system. One thing, of course, is the issue of homogeneity of structures. If we are going to talk about this from a practical point of view, we're talking about laws, we're talking about customs, we're talking about, for example, governing of movement of people and so on among Arab and Muslim states in comparison, for example, to the EU. There are huge disparities. If we look, for example, within the Islamic countries themselves, between rich nations and poor nations, and the issue of concern about distribution of wealth within, that act always as an impeding factor for better integration. Also, the level of industrialization and complementary products. In this case, most of the Islamic countries, Arab countries, and so on, especially the rich one that can import, they produce very similar things: oil, gas, natural gas, and usually they export to the outside. As we mentioned, the will to achieve this kind of integration at what seems to be the most practical level, trade. The will is very weak in order to do this. Yeah, they are, as I mentioned, and as it is known, always there is a tendency to trade with the outside and to integrate with the world economy more than, for example, promoting intra-Muslim trade and so on. So there are, I think, structural differences, huge structural differences. And if you are talking about now, just to conclude, the main obstacle is the issue of, for example, the persuasion, the conviction of states or actors or agents that are willing, for example, to achieve this kind of integration. Whereas in the European Union, there were leading agents or even leading figures and leading leaders that kind of kept pushing for the integration. If you look, for example, in the Muslim world and so on, hardly you will find some kind of, one or two or three agents that are really taking this mission into heart. So that, again, the absence of will, the absence of leadership, and the absence of symmetrical structures. All these are really different factors in terms of when we start comparing between, for example, the Muslim Ummah and the Muslim states and the European Union.
Can see a few hands raised on that same point, I believe, but Dr. Omar, would you like to come in?
Yeah, if I may add briefly, I agree that the EU does provide a model that could be, of course, made better. And it does, I mean, it is a blueprint, however, and it does show how integration could actually work and be beneficial to the states that belong to it. However, there is also the fact that EU integration was made possible and effective mostly because of the contiguity that does exist there. So these countries are next to one another. They mostly share same borders. For the Ummah, that's not necessarily the case unless if we are focusing only on the Gulf states or the Middle East. There are a lot of different regions within the Ummah, and all countries do not necessarily share the same continental continuity, which could potentially provide an obstacle to be overcome. And this is another impediment that the EU didn't have to deal with. I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Let's come to Brother Abdurrahman Rashdan then to comment on that, and inshallah we'll get through everybody else.
Right. Thank you, Sister Aisha, and thank you all for the panelists. MashaAllah, it's a very interesting discussion. And I would say Assalamu alaikum to my dearest professor, Dr. Ahmed. It's been a long time. Nice to see you. So it is sort. I have like, I'm gonna push all of them in one argument. I'm gonna list some points and then push them in one argument and get a conclusion. It's more of a comment than a question. So I think it's first important to understand how the structure, the current international structure, is made to stop any regional effective regional integration that doesn't work within the interest of the leaders of the system. So I'm talking about the US primarily, and secondly would be the European powers. So thinking about the top-down sort of integration, having the states lead the integration between the Muslim Ummah, it's sort of a far-fetched thing. And we have seen a lot of recent effort that have been pushed aside between countries like Turkey and Pakistan and Indonesia and other countries. Those were efforts that have been, and Qatar, and those have been efforts that have been pushed strongly to make them fail in the beginning. So anything from top down would be, on the current international system, would be very hard to achieve. And the system is made to control the actions of the state, right? But the weakness of the international system is more of the public opinions. So when you talk about Muslims within those states that act within, in the Muslim world, that act within the interest of the system, you're gonna find that Muslim public opinion there's a big gap, sort of, depending on which country you look at, but most of the Muslim countries, there's the public opinion towards the Islamic issues is somehow different from the official positions. And this is where we should be talking about the integration level. So back to Dr. Ahmad's point, what level are we talking on, the Ummah or the state? I think we should now be thinking of the Ummah level, the people level, public opinion level, because this is, we already have a lot of things to build on, right? And that's feasible and that's easier to achieve. And we have seen a lot of efforts, again, we're fault, but we're very effective in integrating the public opinion and directing the Ummah towards causes and actually being effective in those. So for example, Mustafa Salama and myself, we worked in Islam Online, and there was very huge effort. And we used to get the feedback from political parties and groups working on the ground, being impacted by the work of one website, and telling us that what the analysis you wrote, the interview, they actually shaped the events on the ground, pushed people and made like some piece, even I think it was in Bangladesh at that time, there was a big rift between two groups, and there was very effective, some media work, right? So things that are outside of the impact of the, outside of the realm of the power of the nation state, the heads of the state. So again, public opinion is the word to start, is the place to start, not the states. And if you look at the system now, it's a moment of friction between the US and the West, like sort of like the power is sort of like going down a bit, and you have friction with the China and maybe India and others rising up. And this is the moment where you can capitalize on the weaknesses of the control that the US basically have around the world. It's pulling itself out of some areas, and those are the areas that we should be jumping in and capitalizing on, again, not from state level, from an Ummah level. And I think part of that capitalization should be using the existing system, not talking about away from the system. So we have the OIC, for example. Look at how the role of the OIC changed when it was led by Turkey versus led by the Saudi Arabia. When it was under Turkey, you can see events, you can see at least statements that were very strong for the Ummah. And it impacted, and it had a lot of work on the ground through the small organizations under the OIC, the bodies under the OIC, that was effective in serving the Ummah. When it was in the hand of Saudi Arabia, all of that went down, and even the statements are very blurry. There's not effective. So you can use, the point here is that you can shape organizations like the OIC, right? How you can do it on a different level, that's not the question here, because talking about more of a theory thing. But in practice, you can shape the OIC, you can shape the funding of the OIC, and you can use it as an arm for the Ummah. And at the same time, work on the other pillars that can change the public opinion in the Ummah. Media is one thing. For example, Waqf, international Waqf projects that can go beyond the strength of the nation state, that can go underneath the nation state and work within the societies and the Muslim Ummah without coming close to the government and trying to, it's a sort of it's a tough call, but they can have an impact. So building those pillars across the states without interacting much with the states, because we know that's hard to change, and using whatever is there, the OIC and others, I think that's a good foundation to talk about long-term integration, because the system is changing. Talking about like 20 years from now, this international system will not be the same. The power and the might of the US that has in different regions in the Muslim world is not going to be the same. It's already changing, and you have regional powers coming up and going down. So this
Sorry,
moment
brother,
we have to
I have to
capitalize.
cut you.
I'll stop here. All right, thank you.
If any of the speakers have any reflections on that point in particular, feel free to jump in. But
yeah, I'll jump in actually. I think that's really well said. I mean, I think that and I think that gets to the question of what other pathways are possible, right? And what I extracted from that was that that public opinion matters, that even individual websites matter. And I don't want to be utopian about the internet, but I think that I mean the internet obviously huge potential for integration and for impact, as Abdurrahman was saying. And then I think this point about the OIC, and then the point about international NGOs or Waqf organizations working sort of across and under the model of the nation state. I think that's really well said. I think that points to some real alternate pathways. I think that that my question then would be sort of the long term, right? So how far can you build integration just from the grassroots level or from the sort of NGO level, and do you then again run into those questions ultimately of hard power and how that's going to work? But maybe the answer to that would be none of that is foreseeable at the moment, right? And just sort of NGO-led or non-state institutions, and then mass public opinion can be integrated more, and then just see where that leads. Stop there.
okay, great. Dr. Osama, we'll come to you.
Sure. Jazakumullah khairan to all the panelists and indeed some of my sort of previous commenters. I have a bit of a cold and I have a bit of a migraine, so I hope I sound coherent, inshallah. But I just wanted to, I mean, there are a whole host of areas in which I was thinking about commenting, and I'm sure I won't be able to do that because I don't think I have a great deal of time. But I was thinking about a number of themes come up: economic integration, political integration. I would argue military integration, which is somewhat distinct from political integration. NATO is distinct from the EU as an institution. Ideological integration. I think universities across the world operate within a kind of post-Enlightenment paradigm and a Eurocentric paradigm, broadly speaking, including universities in our parts of the world, which are basically importing an institutional model which establishes norms which are highly problematic, I think, from an ummatic perspective. But we all do it, and we mostly do it unconsciously, and that's the most powerful kind of norm, the unconscious norm, because you can't, you don't see the air you're breathing. And I think the role of an institution like this, as I see it, is to suddenly make us conscious that we've been writing prose all our life, right? I mean, like, no one ever told us that. And so just a few brief comments. I mean, Greece came up in the EU context, and I also am a sort of an animal of the left, so to speak, when it comes to economic questions. And Yanis Varoufakis is one of my great heroes in this regard. And he was the Greek finance minister trying to confront the EU, a brilliant mind. And one of the comments that he made about European integration, because he was deeply committed to the European idea, and he continues to be, and he's got actually a movement which I think Ummatics should perhaps reach out to, DM25 it's called. But the idea of, he was saying, why is there commitment in the United States, which are federated states, whereas there isn't that level of commitment in a place like the European Union? So we do actually have, I mean, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, when he talks about the reintegration of the Ummah in some of his more political works, he talks about two examples. He's saying that the caliphate, if it were to re-emerge in our time, which is something that we should aspire to, would be federalized or confederalized, as he puts it. And the examples are the United States and the EU, right? So the European Union doesn't have economic integration. It has, and without economic integration, there are severe limits to what you can do as a state. Whereas he was saying, what's the meaning of someone getting a paycheck which says, you know, I forget exactly the phrase he would put, but basically from the federal government, people are getting sort of safety, social safety net sort of payments. It creates a sense of attachment to some distant thing over there, which makes you all part of the United States. These are ideas, these are ideology, basically, fundamentally. And I think those are the sorts of arenas. There are so many arenas in which we need to operate. But I actually think that notwithstanding, you know, the pessimism that you express in the paper, underlying that or underneath that, you can start to recognize actually any idea which is not normative, it should be seen with a certain degree of skepticism. But once we start to recognize that actually this is a problem of what we believe is possible, again, to quote someone like Nelson Mandela, it's always impossible until it's done or until it's achieved. I can't remember the exact phrase. So I think, you know, there are plenty of opportunities. And I, you know, before I came to Matics and read Professor Anjum's work, I read Professor Salman Sayyid's work, which is really fascinating because he thinks about very self-consciously and recalling the Caliphate, very explicit title as well. What does it mean to integrate as an ummah? If, you know, and it's about, I think it's about convincing people that this is something worth believing in, ultimately. As he puts it, you know, a Muslim country would be have the largest population, one of the largest economies, and the largest military in the world. That's something worth believing in. And anyone who thinks that you can't sort of like have a non-contiguous sort of political entity needs to think about how, you know, the remnants of the British Empire or the ongoing Daniel Immerwahr's book, you know, How to Hide an Empire, about the United States and its globalized empire. You know, these things still continue to exist. And if you think about NATO as being really an arm of the United States with everyone else as being something of a client state, I think we still live in that sort of condition. Allahu a'lam.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Osama. Dr. Omar or Dr. Imad, anyone got any comments on that? Or if not, we can go to Mustafa. Okay. Go ahead, Mustafa. I think your comment is somewhat related.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Clearly? I'm all right. I'd just like to thank everyone for this great colloquium, and let me jump right into my comments. Obviously, the paper is talking about the pessimism or perceived unpracticality or infeasibility of multilateral organizations. And though that is the case, there is still a lure and attractiveness to the EU model. I'd just like to point out that though we tend to speak of the EU as an economic cooperation or integrated model, we tend to forget that at the backdrop of the EU, there is NATO, a military alliance which holds these countries together, or the majority of them. Without speaking of that military alliance, you can't really speak of NATO. Okay, NATO is the military alliance, the security structure that holds these countries together, and the EU is simply the economic model that follows. But you can't really have economic cooperation without some guarantee of security or some sort of military cooperation at the background. Second, the EU is based on the nation state, and the nation state naturally arose from Europe. That is their reflection of their political model. It is a natural extension of their public opinion and their political will. In the Muslim world, the nation state has not naturally come from the political will of its people. So saying saying the model of the EU is something that we should aspire to, I don't think that's the case. The nation states of Europe still want to maintain their national identity. That is something that, you know, their borders are something that, you know, they would still like to maintain. I think in the Muslim world, if the people were able to express their political will in an institutional form, it would be something that is different to the EU. And that gives us really a future consideration of different pathways that we could look into to go forward. I'm sorry, it's a bit noisy in here. It's kind of easy to get distracted. Thank you.
No, thank you, Mustafa. We could hear clearly. Alhamdulillah. Any reflections on that point in particular from anyone? Okay, I think Dr. Aziza, did you have your hand up previously?
Yes, Aisha, thank you. What I'm gonna keep my video off because of the strength of the connection, please. I thought I shouldn't comment anymore because my comment really is a spin-off, I think, of Professor Osama Azami's comment. And my reflection is, I think, from Professor Thurston's paper and the respondents and the comments so far. Thankfully, there is an Ummah. Yeah, however scattered it is, there is one already. And I think perhaps what may appear too simplistic a question is really why integrate? Is it a spiritual imperative to integrate? Is it because scattered as the Muslim population are, there are existential threats, or are there material prospects to integration? Because I think really the problem would be, as Professor Azami said, getting people from a particular worldview to a different worldview. So it's then what would get people's buy-in. So maybe because I come from a context like in Nigeria that we have Muslims scattered across over 500 tribes. And the question of integration, even across that, always gives certain problems. Why integrate? What do we stand to gain? Or are we simply going to sort of validate new models of simply doing exactly what we've been doing and creating more problems? So I think these are foundational questions. The why. I don't know if that makes sense. Thank you.
I'd like to put some of those foundational questions to some of our presenters, if possible. The why integrate? Is it just, has it got the potential to cause more problems than give solutions?
Yeah, I think those are powerful questions, and I think that you know, one consideration of any kind of integration would be, right, the new power dynamics that would obtain even in successful integration, and that there could be, you know, serious power imbalances, right, within that, and drawbacks, as the speaker was saying. I think that integration, I mean, I think that as some of the comments were indicating, I think that there is a desire for this in you know, substantial swaths of public opinion, from what I can tell, a desire for some level of greater integration. I mean, clearly at a minimum, a lot of human beings, a lot of Muslims care about things that are happening to fellow human beings or to fellow Muslims in other parts of the world, right? There's a sense of you know, caring about the fate of people, particularly in you know, places that are severely affected by oppression or injustice or crisis and so forth, that I think there's a significant popular desire to have more power to help and to change those situations. I think that one of the key arguments for integration would be that it would benefit ordinary people, right? That a larger political, economic, security unit would ultimately result in significant improvements to people's lives, right? Inshallah, that there would be an enhancement of economic opportunity, there would be an enhancement of political power, there would be an enhancement of collective security and so forth. On the other hand, one could say no, not necessarily, right? That what has the political power of the United States on the world stage really brought for ordinary Americans, right? In some ways, you could say actually that the United States' pursuit of power on the world stage has taken away all sorts of things that ordinary Americans could have, right? In terms of money that's spent on the American military instead of on healthcare or caring for the homeless or something like that. So yeah, I think these are powerful questions. I mean, and I think I could do more it goes well beyond my paper, but I think I could do more to articulate some of the rationale and then maybe some of the trade-offs for pursuing integration.
Dr. Omar or Dr. Imad, would either of you like to come into that? Yeah, Dr. Imad.
Yes, if I may. I'm sorry, I had to silence the microphone. Well, if I may add, of course, I mean, this is a good question. Why integrate? There are, of course, a number of factors. One is the identity issue among Muslims. The feeling that still there is a very strong, deep-rooted concept of a notion of an ummah that shares certain history, certain traditions, certain values, and certain aspirations. They might not be as strong everywhere, but at least they exist. And the proof that they exist is the issue of this still, it's not lack of acceptance, but still weak acceptance of the nation state with its kind of, sovereign borders that are not transcendent. There is this notion of a transcendent nation until now. I always give this example that during the Intifada, the Egyptian government arrested 11 teenage, actually they were 12 years of age, students who fled their school, ran away from the school, and went to Rafah to throw stones and participate in the Intifada. That's the identity issue. That's the transcendence of issue. The second thing, as Dr. Alex mentioned, the economic aspect. Out of 57 least developed nations, 22 are Muslim countries. 22 states are Muslim countries out of the 57 least developed nations. So that's, of course, from an Islamic point of view, is unacceptable for so many people, given the richness overall, on average, of many Muslim countries that, for example, can contribute to ameliorate this kind of deficiency and shortcoming. These are just two. The last thing, of course, is when we are talking about a global level, is the ability to impact the decision-making process. And that's an important issue. If you are separate states, your ability to influence is much lesser than being, for example, a kind of a conglomerate, a well-integrated group of nations that can impact the decision-making process at the global level. These are just some of many. There are other, of course, reasons. History, the idea of the golden age of Muslims and Islam that still lingers in everyone's mind. For example, look at Baghdad and what happened, on CNN when Baghdad was stormed and was bombed and so on. In the memory of Muslim, this is something big. This is Baghdad, the cradle of Muslim civilization. Until now, there are these notions that, yes, it might sound like ideal and romantic, but that's what people's history and aspirations are made for.
Thank you, Dr. Imad. Sami, we'll come to Brother Sami then for your comment on that as well, I think.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Apologies for not opening the video. I was shopping while I was listening to this through my headphones, and now I'm sitting around somewhere, perhaps shouldn't be shown on video. But barakallahu fikum for the interventions, for the presentations and the like. Mine is less of a comment and more to ask for some thoughts. Particularly, Dr. Alex made a very interesting point and a very human point in the midst of a lot of the theorizing, which is the idea that one of the things that nation states are struggling to fathom when they come and try to join these organizations, which on many occasions they've joined sincerely. You know, I'm coming from North Africa. I remember for 24 hours, Tunisia and Libya united. Bourguiba and Gaddafi, they sat down together and said, let's unite the countries. And then Bourguiba panicked and said, maybe the Libyans will overcome. They'll be too strong. I can't manage them. Let me pull out instead. But the idea here being that, you know, this idea of how this idea of compromising national sovereignty is problematic. But I think there is another angle to it besides the idea of power, which is, what is my place in your eyes? You who are asking me to give up the national sovereignty, what is my place in your eyes? And the reason I say that is because I've always been very interested in that when the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam went to Medina, he created two categories of people, Muhajirin and Ansar. Both were equal, but the impact of that name, that identity, was that beforehand there was Aws and Khazraj who were fighting each other left, right, center for decades, and they had the tha'ar for generation after generation. Suddenly he elevated them to Ansar and insisted that they were equal to Muhajirin, which is why we have the famous instance when one of them recites a poem about a former battle between Aws and Khazraj. The Prophet comes and says, Abi da'wal jahiliya wa ana bainakum. But do you call this call to jahiliya when I'm between you? But the thing I found fascinating about it is, growing up, I thought it meant the eradication of a tribal identity, until I came across a report in which, after the Prophet ﷺ dies, the Sahaba come together and say that the rest of the Arabs will only follow Quraysh, and therefore it's better to appoint somebody from Quraysh. The point here being is that that story does not necessarily mean the eradication, but more about the prioritizing of a particular identity, which leads me to this idea, this concept of, when we're creating these organizations and when you're asking a smaller nation to cede sovereignty, knowing full well a powerful nation is now in a position to take advantage, to what extent can we promote an identity in the Ummatic framework which reconciles between these legitimate fears that somebody might have? And the question that was put, why integrate? In many ways, it may not be the way that Dr. Aziza tried to put it, but the way I heard it was, why are you asking me to give up something that is part of me and take this gamble and risk on something that is bigger? Is there another way in which we can do it where I don't have to give something up and then pay the price for it later? And the reason that question is asked is because there is this scenario in which I'm giving something up and I am suddenly less valued than somebody else who's in that particular organization. And that's why I think there is a huge hikmah or wisdom in the term Ansar, or in the term Muhajirin, or in the term that the Prophet ﷺ gave to these people, to say to them that I've elevated you. You're not tribes in my eyes. You are Ansar who helped me, and you are Muhajirin who came with me from Mecca to Medina, and you are both valued. And one of the reasons, and I'll finish on this point because I know I don't want to take too long. I know it's only 2 minutes, and I'm terrified Hannah is going to cut me off. But the point here is this. So when I look at, for example, moves such as the Turkic Council, which perhaps may not be the best example, but I see Erdogan going now to Uzbekistan, going to Kazakhstan, going to Kyrgyzstan. I've sat in the EU meetings with the delegations of the Turkic Council, and one thing that I've noticed is nationalist Turks are using the term Turkish Islam as part of what they're promoting in Uzbekistan. Putin's fear is over this Turkic Council is such that when Kazakhstan's government was under protest, he sent his troops there to send a message to Turkey to say to the rest, to Kyrgyzstan, that listen, you may like what Erdogan is giving you, but I'm the one who gives you that military protection. In other words, there is this fear from Russia over this ideology that has seen Uzbekistan lift restrictions on mosques, lift restrictions on Quran, lift restrictions on children going and the like. My point here being is that the Turkic Council is not the ideal body, but what Erdogan has done with it is he's gone to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and said to them, I see you as equal to me. I have this identity here that I'm presenting to you, in which if you join this body, you're not less in any way whatsoever. We are all together valued as one tribe, and they are buying into it. When Putin gets angry, he's angry because they are buying into it, even though it does not offer the same economic and political benefits as being part of Russia. So I want to hear some, sorry, I wouldn't put it in a nicer way. I'd like to hear some thoughts on this idea, in that if you're asking me to give up something that my whole life I believed is a key part of me, that I am of Arab descent from Tunisia, from a small country of only 10 million people, and I'm joining a country with 90 million Masr al-Mahrusa, Dunya, and I'm joining a 35 million Saudi Arabia with all the money and the like. When I go to Saudi, sometimes I might hear comments, these are North Africans, hot-blooded, backward people. When I go to this place, these little comments, they affect. But the point here being is that how do we create an ummatic identity conducive that makes the person sacrificing what they thought was their identity? How do we maintain their value or make them feel like they are still valued in such an institution? Apologies for the vague term or the vagueness of what I'm saying, but I hope it's understood. This idea that if you're asking me to give something up for something greater, how do I show that person is still 100% value as opposed to 70% in comparison to somebody else? I haven't phrased the question properly, but that's because I haven't eaten my lunch yet.
Thank you, Sami. It's all right. I think the question is clear. Dr. Azizat, would you like to clarify coming in on that, or no?
Well, I think I'm still reflecting very deeply. Okay. But maybe I asked that question because I also work in the field of application of Islamic law now in broader states than were during colonialism, colonial Nigeria. And there's always this ideological reason, or rather resistance, even from some Muslims. Why do you need this, you know? And sort of, I think it's a thing to reflect on, to also borrow on larger wisdom, because it's sort of like a small project. But I suppose that by Umatics, you know, comparing with what Umatics is trying to do, which I completely, you know, believe in, the point of asking is not from a point of I'm giving up something of value, which is my national identity, for integrating into a spiritual identity, but more of the why, as to why do we need this ummah? And in the sense of Ibn Qayyim, a scholar saying, you do not really need to apply Islamic law because you have a caliphate. Or namely that you don't really need to have a superstructure for application. I'm giving an example of Islamic law before you do apply Islamic law, because everything starts from the whole ideology of who you are and the place of a Muslim in the world. So sort of the why, how do you convince people? Do you only speak to that scriptural imperative? And I think additionally, we need to also reason out material prospects that are scripturally sound, okay, for the worldview that would create the ummah. I don't know if that sort of presents what I'm trying to say a bit clearer, but is a reflection in progress. Sorry if I confused more than clarify. Thank you.
No, thank you, Dr. Azizat. I know we as well have a couple of attendees who want to ask a question. I will come to you, but Dr. Amar, you had your hand up. Would you like to comment here?
Yes, thank you. I think this is a really, really important question that Sister Azizat and also Brother Sami have addressed. And thanks for raising this question. Why integrate? What is to be gained? And what could be lost? What could be the downside of integration? I'll be very materialist here. And Alex does talk about it also in the paper. One very pedestrian but really important benefit of integration is the freedom of movement of people. People aspire to move around, to go seek better working conditions and better life opportunities elsewhere. And integration would mean that people are freer to move around, and that can make huge positive effects in their lives, but also in the state, because when people are allowed to go and settle somewhere else and move around and find better working opportunities, it does make a huge impact and a positive one, I think.
Okay, great, inshallah. Let's go to Sister Aisha. She's had her hand up for a while. Sister Aisha, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, I'd just like to say a few points. For me, Ummatic must ultimately be universal, at least in ideation and its understanding. So why are we not considering the humankind as a potential ummah? That is something that I always think about. And also I think that for this particular purpose, we require a combination of idealism and pragmatism. I do understand the limits to the possible and the daira mumkinat that Ibn Khaldun has, talked about. But we can also look at what can be done, like what is the basis or foundation of the European Union? And also why should we rely on external models and why not develop our own indigenized model that could more serve our purpose? And as I said, why is the Ummatic limited to Muslims only? Even in our Ummatic model, we could think of adding on other people if it is beneficial for us or if it is suited for us, just as EU would consider adding Turkey to it if it is beneficial for it or if it serves its purpose. And I also think that a global legal institution is very much the need, because that is something that the Ummah needs and it lacks very much. Then the refugee crisis is also, we're talking about mobilization, so we should also consider that, which is already taking place. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sister Aisha. Does anybody want to come in particularly on that point? Or go ahead, Dr. Alex.
I'll just say briefly, I would really second that, to think of, I think that's a really good point, and I want to think about it more, to think of the Ummatic as applying to all of humanity in some sense. I think that's really well said.
Okay, Mustafa, we'll come to you. Go ahead again.
Okay, I just wanted to get back to the why question. And I think we could have three simple points. First, it's a religious and spiritual imperative. Basically, Allah commands us to be united. In several verses of the Quran, this is something that is unanimous. This is something that no one disagrees upon. إنما هذه أمتكم أمة واحدة وأنا ربكم فاعبدون. Verily, this ummah is one, and I am your Lord, so worship me. Second, let's think of security. The bigger a political structure you are, the more powerful you're going to be. This is the adhan in Istanbul right now. I'm not sure if you can hear it, but basically the most powerful nations on earth are superpowers. Superpowers can only be as such if they muster the economic and military power that they have. Second is economic prosperity. The bigger you are, the bigger the economy you have, and the more resources you have for everyone. And I'll just keep it at that. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Mustafa. I think we all enjoyed hearing that snippet of the adhan there, direct from Istanbul. Okay, alhamdulillah. Did anybody else want to come in on that point, Dr. Imad?
I think I agree. These are I did already, but this is very important. I mean, these are very important points, and I agree with them, of course.
All right, inshallah. In that case, if there's no other final comments or questions that anybody has, any closing words from our speakers?
I'll just say I was trying to follow the chat the whole time, and there was a lot of, people made a lot of great points in the chat, alhamdulillah. So sorry to not be able to respond to some of those as they came, but I was reading them.
Yes, alhamdulillah. There's been some really good conversations going on in the chat box from what I can see as well. Yes, Dr. Imad, go ahead.
Very quickly, I mean, this was a very enriching conversation. I really enjoyed of course, the paper, reading the paper and the presentations, and also the comments of the participants very much. I just want to say a few words. I think, that I can deduce from the discussions that as a nation, as Ummatic, we have a multiplicity of objectives and goals, but we have limited resources. So I think, one way forward is all of what we have talked about, for example, the issue of integration, the issue of unity, the issue of economic prosperity, the issue of security, and so on. There are so many objectives as an ummah, as a nation, that we would like to achieve, but they will require formidable resources, which most of us do not have. That's why we need to focus. Maybe prioritize the issues and the topics, and then create networks, focus groups that will address these issues from maybe an intellectual point of view and a practical point of view as well. To propose, and this is the most important, I think, thing, to see the way forward, how we are going to translate these kind of concepts and intellectual endeavors into practical steps that can help us move forward. And thank you so much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to participate in this very, very outstanding panel.
Alhamdulillah. No, thank you so much to all of our speakers today. Oh, Dr. Azizat, yes, you're just in time. Go ahead if you want to raise
Thank
something.
you. And I think my final thoughts would be from Dr. Ahmed, that perhaps we see Integration Day as majorly an intellectual process for now, not necessarily mechanical. And that's, I think, what the point of my reflection. I started from the fact that I think there is an Ummah already. The fact that we have all these nation states does not necessarily mean that you do not have an affinity for a Muslim from anywhere. So it's a question of integrating. And I think maybe the problem or the challenge is intellectualizing the process to sort of create a mind view or a mindset that is different from the capitalistic and individualistic worldview that underpins existing multilateral organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aziz. That's some interesting thoughts to leave us on. We are nearing the end of our session today, alhamdulillah, but I'm going to briefly hand over to Dr. Osama for some closing remarks, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khairan, Sister Aisha, and to especially our sort of presenter, Dr. Alex Thurston, Professor Alex Thurston, for a very thoughtful paper that in some respects questions the imperative that underpins ummatics, and that's precisely the sort of question that is needed at this stage of the formation of an institution of this kind, to ask the very fundamental questions. And I think the responses from Dr. Ahmed and Dr. Omar illustrate the richness of our sort of scholarly elite, if you'll permit the phrase. We have a lot of very talented scholars to draw on from a diversity of backgrounds. Unfortunately, too many of them seem to be in North America right now, but we'll put that aside for the moment. And it's really a great honor to be able to sort of, for ummatics to be able to host scholars like yourselves and panelists like yourselves from, again, various parts of the world. I just want to express great gratitude on behalf of the Ummatics Institute. So let me shift gears slightly and speak about the Ummatics Institute. This has been the next stage of the Ummatics Colloquium, and many of you, if not most of you, have been on this journey with us. So these colloquia are opportunities to think about ummatic concerns in a very systematic and reflective manner. But the Ummatics Institute is a sort of institutionalizing, shall we say, of that sort of thinking. So inshallah, it will have greater staying power. And we want all of you to stay involved with us. We're going to have, inshallah, in the month of June, an inaugural conference. And we've had immense interest from around the world. We've had a wonderful call for papers with very strong, inshallah, submissions. And we're looking forward to hosting that in Istanbul. And I hope to see as many of you as possible there, inshallah. This will be an in-person event. It won't be live streamed, so that's further incentive for you to try and figure out a way to make your way there. So with that, I just want to thank you all again for joining this session. Please go to the Ummatics website, ummatics.org, and if you've not already done so, put your name down for the mailing list to be kept up to date on what's going on. The sort of socials have also been posted on the chat. So if you've not already started following on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, please do that straight after this session. Just look for Ummatics. It's a nice distinctive name. It has the advantage of branding distinction. So I will leave you with that, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us tawfiq in all of our future endeavors. Subhanak Allahumma bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Dr. Osama. Assalamu alaikum to everybody. And just a quick note, as he said, that to please keep an eye on all of our social media channels for our upcoming events. Our next colloquium is, alhamdulillah, already confirmed for February 15th. And inshallah, we will actually have Dr. Hussam ad-Din Muhammad, who is one of our attendees today, presenting alongside his colleague, Dr. Ray Jureidini, on an Ummatic approach to refugee ethics. So inshallah, stay tuned for the details of that event, and we look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you again to our speakers today, Dr. Alex Thurston, Dr. Umar Ba, and Dr. Imad Shaheen. From all of us here at Ummatics, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much, everybody. Assalamu alaikum.